welcome to the second session for this morning. It's a pleasure to chair again. Chairing is interesting because you can sit on top but not think a lot about what you're going to say. For this reason, I want to pass the floor to people who know what they say more than usually. So I will start with Emilia Palonen, who is going to give us an interesting comparison of the Finno-Ugric populism in Finland and Hungary. And without more ado, I would like to give you the floor. Welcome, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming to listen to me, even if Hungary and Finland might not be so interesting cases than Greece. Okay, so you know me already, and my paper is really about fringe, mainstream, and competing populisms. But please ask me more about the cases that I look in the questions if you want. I had some trouble getting everything in, especially with the comparison and theory. It's difficult to have really good balance to keep you updated. I hope you follow my point. So my point really is, my argument is that we should be looking at populism within political parties rather than just naming populist parties and then studying them. And I start from this definition of populism that relies on antagonism and simplifying articulation of the people or other overarching empty signifiers as common point of identification. And I see populism then not as a permanent characteristic of populist parties or any party. I've been discussing some of these things before, and I hope to discuss this later, but I kind of bracketed the ones that I don't have the time to address in this talk. But for instance, this extent of populism has been one of my research interests. Also, it's worth noting again, as Cristóbal mentioned, we should look at this, what is not populism. So for Laclau, of course, and my background is in Laclauian theory of populism, he contrasts populism with institutionalism, but then we could also look at this articulation versus one-to-one representation, or mere identification versus technocracy, perhaps. And I've argued somewhere that if we have too much populism, that would be a threat to democracy. We can discuss that. Here we discuss populist leadership a little bit because Giannis' background paper invited me to reflect on that, and then populist dynamics, which is the general theme of this paper. And then a couple of words about crisis and populists in power. I've taken kind of like a 2-year break from the study of populism. I mainly discussed and written about cultural populism in the meanwhile. But there's the background to this study. So a couple of unpublished papers and a lot of published papers too, about Hungary mainly. And this Finnish populism is yet to be covered. This was, I woke up one morning and I saw myself presenting this slide to you. So I argue that things in general may start with 0, but politics starts with becoming even temporarily 1. Here you can see a populist movement, one version of a populist movement, with 1 as the leader. And you can see that 1 is not necessarily needed for becoming the symbol of the populist movement. But the unity in the movement itself might be the signifier for this common unity or populism. But we shouldn't regard this movement as sort of an organic flow, but sort of filled with sort of micro level hierarchies, conflicts, moments of decisions, etc. And the movement itself can change. People might come to different conclusions within the movement. And that's something that we should also consider. Meanings, policies, leaders, slogans, they also may change over time. And when I was writing this slide, I was thinking about the Finnish populist, nominally populist party, Finns party. And when I was listening to Comrade Muselis, I was also thinking, how is the change more difficult perhaps in a clientelistic network? So these zeros and ones would be more difficult to change. Okay, so here's some text. So I think we're making a mistake quite often when we treat Ernst Laclau's theory as static, because it should be about process and logics at different levels. So it's actually a much more dynamic theory than we have understood it to be, and especially those kind of who are not as knowledgeable about Laclau as some of the people here, they treat it as like a theory that enables people to find this unity in hegemony. But there's no reason why we shouldn't really emphasize this processual character of the theory of hegemony and allow for different kind of contestation within the party or movement. So I'm arguing here that there's kind of a heterogeneity that's characteristic of any political movement, any political setting. And freezing this might be one way for a movement to sort of maintain their integrity, but at the same time it might sort of lose the populist element of that movement and the sort of and the ethos of populism as understood by Laclau. So the hegemonic process should be kept fluid, and we should really look at this transformation dynamics and spatial temporal changes when we think about populism. So what I've done years ago already is to discuss these logics of populism. And now recently I started using the concept of dynamics. Maybe you won't tell me that it's really silly, but now I'm trying to persuade you that dynamics is a good way to describe certain issues. This guy is going to be quite important for you Greeks because he's the foreign minister of Finland. And he's one of the reasons why our finance minister cannot really be agreeing with the Greeks. Because the argument of Finn's party was that we shouldn't be giving money to Greece. So this is how he got quite a lot of votes. And it's quite characteristic of this guy that he wanted to become the foreign minister, even if he's head of the second most important party in government. He didn't want to have that finance minister role, but he wanted to have his impact in Europe. He's also a master of empty signifiers, and his background is in this kind of urbanized version of peasant populism. But he's not the only one in his party. There's quite a lot of these anti-immigration figures in the party. There's this picture here is of Jussi Halla-aho, an MEP, who's famous for his even racist comments. And currently, as Finns party are in the government since a month, I've been trying to understand what they are really about, what is their policy and what's their point. And it seems that they are, at the moment it seems that they are turning into an anti-immigration party, more like a single issue party, which wouldn't be a populist party, than a populist party. Even though, so in his heritage is put in question. So one question is, how do populist parties transform, and can they kind of cease to be populist parties? What would be kind of the limit of populism, of populist parties? My second figure to show you is Viktor Orban. He's the post-communist politician in the country. He started, this first picture is from him at the Imre Nagy's reburial in '89, and he established this movement for youth, Party for the Youth, and then he turned his rhetoric into nation and sought to kind of represent all those people who were thinking in terms of the nation, so occupying the national pole in Hungarian politics. Then he developed he moved kind of away from a pure nationalism or nation-centric discourse into something like this civic bourgeois progressive Polgari discussion, which is kind of also like inclusive, but at the same time slightly exclusive, that there would be those who wouldn't be that sort of progressive and forward-looking, and there we can see some similarities with this Greek case, I think, of the past. And he realized that, okay, he didn't get elected in 2002. He moved to different sort of populism, this kind of extra-parliamentary village-style populism, where he's wearing these stripy shirts instead of the previous sleek image that he had. And he didn't go to the parliament for quite some time to do his representational duties there. And he talked about these village parliaments, etc., and established kind of direct democracy process, obviously for the sake of his party and movement. And now he's been in government, he's on the second term since 2014, and he's starting to have this very tough anti-immigration rhetoric, but also appear as kind of football-loving statesman. And this is not, I mean, these are not necessarily like, these are kind of perhaps like the outer characteristics of a populist party, but there's been, they have really tried to occupy the representation of the people in the party. They're having some trouble at the moment with this, and we will see about the next elections, and by-elections have been lost by Fidesz recently. So back to my dynamics of populism. So I'm talking about, I made this analytical distinction between fringe, mainstream, and competing populism. And fringe populism is something that challenges the system from kind of supposedly outside the system. It's anti-system parties. And here there are some examples of those parties, not necessarily only from Finland and Hungary. So this is the challenge, the threat. The problem is with the system, and challenge is from the outside. Mainstream populism is kind of declaring the representation of people, and like trying to occupy this position. But then at the same time saying relatively little about actual policies, for instance. And at the same time generating the antagonistic frontier with the others claiming that they cannot be representing the people as well as we can. So mainstream populist parties, for example, are Fidesz, and in Finland, National Coalition Party under Katainen and perhaps Stubb, and Centre Party in these elections. You know, we have a millionaire as a prime minister in Finland now. He's from the Centre Party, and he was totally vague about what he was wanting to do, but they had this very much like argument that they are representing the people, and really like the people versus the Helsinki elites. And this is mainstream party. They were in government previous time, 4 years earlier. So it's a little bit difficult for them to claim that they would be totally speaking from like a fringe position like this, even if they were in the opposition. One of the two parties in opposition we had 4 years ago. And now we have this thing. So competing populism is the third analytical distinction. And this is what I wrote my PhD thesis about in 2006 on Hungary. And when I realized that there is this sort of situation where two camps create their identities in the opposition of the other. So it's the identification with the other camp that would be creating the identity of us. So rather than giving much substance to your arguments or your position, you would be just negating the other and challenging this other at all times. It also caused this lack of internal contestation because the stakes were rather even. So the parties couldn't really be challenging the leaders of the parties or the sort of demonstrating that there would be some dissonance within these parties. So we really didn't know what the parties would be sort of wanting to do if they were in power. And if they were in power and they were kind of changing every 4 years, they were having relatively similar policies. But this political frontier was really frozen and it was spreading everywhere. So when you would go for a job in the interview, you would be basically found out on which side you would be. And so it had this sort of cultural dimension also. Yeah. So here, that's the situation that I looked at. And that situation persisted to roughly 2010. And then you know that the left in Hungary has, they are divided. The former figureheads, former prime ministers are setting up their own parties, have set up their own parties. And there's a reluctance to give up power. So it would be kind of similar situation if here PASOK would be, PASOK leaders would be setting up their own parties and not allowing for anything else to emerge on the left. It wasn't always easy to do this research because it's so politicized. So I found this blogging online, and they were discussing this article that I wrote. And she's this left-wing Hungarian writing from abroad, and really at this point they were, and I think now too, it was very difficult for the left to understand that populism could have some positive meanings. So they were contesting this idea that anybody could claim that they are populists, and also any criticism towards the left would be immediately taken as like unfounded. So that's an example of the impossibility of internal critique also in Hungary. So I said there that both sides professed this rhetoric, populist rhetoric. Okay. Populist dynamics. Why would we use these concepts? It enables us to look at these populist movements rather than populist parties and populist movements. So recognizing that there might be in politics populist movements. And also that perhaps makes it easier to take seriously this claim that populism is common in politics and is essential for politics and democracy, but it's not that we shouldn't be totally equating the two. So it's challenging this problem that Laclau has been accused of. We have named here before. And we are also able to look at this transformation from one dynamic to another if we are making this analytical distinction, so we can see what changes in the populism of Fidesz, for instance, or what is changing now perhaps with Finns party. And it also offers, I hope, a basis for comparative analysis. And here's an example of what we could get from this if we thought about crises. So from the perspective of fringe populism, the system is in crisis and elites are responsible for the crisis. Mainstream populism sees that there is a crisis and we are the response to this, or the crisis is external somehow. And there's also this idea that crises might be always repeated. And competing populism's crisis would be caused by the other side, or now or in the future. So I'd argue that even though we can see that there are kind of actually existing crises, they are always discursively articulated and they are used in politics. We can see now like this crisis rhetoric transforming from one dynamic or position to another and being different in one dynamic or position. So Fidesz is quite famous for its sort of continuous articulation of the crisis, and I've written a paper about their continuous revolutionary rhetoric, so that actually rupture is seen as continuous in Hungary, in their rhetoric. And now also the anti-immigration rhetoric is a response to this crisis. Perhaps also a response, of course, to the emergence of Jobbik, this fringe populist party. And it seems to me that Fidesz are taking up all possible policies or ideas from the Jobbik and sort of claiming them for themselves, integrated it into their chain of equivalencies, and not realizing that what really Jobbik is arguing and is able to argue from a fringe populist position is that the elites are corrupt. And Fidesz are inevitably part of these elites. And there's a lot of clientelism involved with this populism, as I said someone before. So they wouldn't be able to deny this fact that they are actually the elites when they are in power. They were able to do this from 2002 to 2008, and they really tried to show how they are not in power and how they are kind of for the underdog. But now it is a different thing. Also, the concept of underdog would be quite interesting to study here. Okay, my last slide is about what happens to populism when populists are in power. We don't really know. I mean, I took part in this workshop, ECPR workshop in 2010, and we were discussing this thing. But I think we're getting ever closer to understanding what could be happening. And there are different, like in Europe, I mean, different ways we can go: institutionalization, moving from this kind of universalism of populism to particularism, like single issue party, or then the breaking up of different parties. Yeah. So I hope we will be getting some questions together on this later. And so thanks so much for inviting me. I'd like to show this all-male panel. Can I still do that? And I don't know how that works, so here. We become famous. No, sorry.
Censorship.
But do you go and see these all-male panels, because we've been congratulated for having almost an all-male conference. But I'm really happy and grateful that you invited me, and now that I can focus on things on political science again, I'd be happy to cooperate with anybody. So please accept my apologies for this irony.
Thank you. No, I tried to do it better, but it's obvious that the system doesn't want us. Thank you for being very punctual. I have a very small question. Does the party's name is Finns or True Finns?
Well, this is really a debate because, or there shouldn't be a question about it. They have never had an English name, True Finns. It's been named by others. So this is really coming to this Ernesto's point about what is in the name, and they wanted to name themselves in English. The Finns parties, basic Finns would be direct translation, but True Finns not. And that's also what is confusing them.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, it would be interesting as a signifier as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Giorgos Katsambekis, who is going to give us in 20 minutes an overview of the extreme right-wing populism in the entire Europe. Good luck.
Not in the entire Europe, actually. But anyway, this is part of the thematic studies that we're doing at the Populismus project. So it's basically the presentation, the outline of one of the thematic studies. The issue here is rather obvious. It is becoming almost a cliché to stress nowadays that in the European context, populism is too often associated to the right or the extreme right, the far right, and there's xenophobic, anti-immigrant parties. This is something that is all the more recognized within the academia too nowadays, with statements like the one you can read here from Stein van Kessel in a very, very recent book. So indeed, the last 2 or 3 decades in Europe has seen the rise of several parties that seem to belong to the right or far right of the political spectrum and to articulate in their discourses calls to the people and to popular sovereignty, pitting themselves against established party elites, but also against a dangerous other or dangerous others within society, usually immigrants. So these developments are reflected in a constantly growing literature, as you can see in the first diagram here, extracted by Google Ngrams, which is a huge corpus of books that Google has scanned. I guess you all know Google Books. And you can see how the interest for the populist right has been rising from the mid-70s until, I think the latest data are until 2008, 2009, but I think it keeps rising. Now, compare this with the interest on the populist left. You can see that the interest on the populist left hasn't really developed, while on the populist right it has spiked. Now, this creates various side effects. One of these side effects is that scientific studies that allegedly focus on populism in general actually only study the right or the extreme right. And I have here a very recent example entitled, a book by Albertazzi and MacDonald entitled Populists in Power. And when you get to read the book, you realize that they actually focus on the right and the extreme right of the political spectrum, focusing on the people of freedom and the Northern League in Italy and on the Swiss People's Party. Now, I could mention 10 or 20 examples like this, but I only have 2 or 3 here. Another one is from Abel Berezin, who acknowledges the variability of populist phenomena, acknowledging the existence of populist parties both on left and right, but nevertheless accepts the use of populism as a default term in public discourse and in the scholarly literature to describe the political phenomena that comprise the class of events constituting the right. So she focuses again mostly on right-wing or extreme right populist parties. And another very characteristic example, not very recent, but very characteristic, Rudd and others tried to map, and actually did an excellent job in mapping varieties of populism, but while they embark on a project to map these various populist phenomena, what they actually do is map only populism on the right and the extreme right. And you can see again the political parties here: Swiss People's Party, the French National Front, the Dutch Prim Fortuyn List, the Belgian Flemish Bloc, the German Republicans, and the Freedom Party of Austria, the FPO. So Gidron and Bonikovsky are right in their critique that this creates many problems. And I have here a quotation which is actually a critical response to the previous paper. And they say that it is questionable whether populist rhetoric appears only among right-wing parties. By looking only at parties that are known in advance to be right-wing populist, and I would add here, or extreme right, or far right, or even extremist right, the range of populist claims is indeed a priori limited by the research design. There is therefore a need for a broader analysis which could explore the variety of populist claims along the entire political spectrum. So this is taken very seriously into account, this remark by Zidron and Bonikovsky, and also by other scholars. I could mention here Katsambekis and Cristobal, who have done an amazing job in putting various twists in the discussion, introducing concepts like inclusionary versus exclusionary populism, apart from differentiating between left and right. We revisit the discussion on extreme right-wing populism in Europe, and here we're using the term extreme right-wing populism in a rather loose sense. We're starting from a point of departure is a general perception of the extreme right, and then trying to problematize and reflect on it, doing a reflexive reading. And we pose a series of questions that Giannis also mentioned it in the first day. So how populist? What's the relationship between nationalist xenophobia and populism? What's the relationship between the notion of the people and the nation, or even the race? So how anti-elite, against which elites, and in which ways, and how anti-establishments? Of course, there are a few more questions here that we could pose. At the same time, we're trying to put emphasis on left-wing populisms in Europe, adding a comparative perspective and highlighting similarities and differences in order to get a better picture, in order to understand the complexities entailed in a populist articulation. So we're starting from 3 countries of focus, of course, because there's only so much that you can do. You cannot start and study all of Europe. So our starting point is the Netherlands, Greece, and France. And we did so because in the Netherlands, Greece, and France, you have prominent right-wing populist parties, or extreme right-wing populist party, but you also have their left counterparts. So these are the materials of our research. We started with a thorough literature review. Then we proceeded also with expert interviews and with politicians, activists, interviews, and also party documents. Our basic methodology, as described by Giannis, is the S-school discourse analysis. So it's a mainly qualitative analysis in the first step, but we also proceed with quantitative analysis, both text analysis and through collaboration with Ioannis Andreadis, also surveys. But I will tell more about this a bit later. So the guiding assumption, as it might be obvious already, is that the categorization of various populist parties as populists should be revisited and reassessed. Because very often the primary element in such parties is clearly a version of nationalism or nativism, as Katsambekis terms it, of xenophobia or anti-immigrantism. I think this is some kind of a neologism. I found it in several books. Anyway, mainly it's anti-Islamism in Central and Northern Europe, but also a more general anti-immigrant rationale, which can be focused on culture and civic terms, or in outright nationalist and essentialist term, or ethnic nationalisms. So this means that Katsambekis might have been right all along. In his seminal study in 2007, he was stressing something that is very often ignored in the relevant literature. I have here a very characteristic quotation. He says that populist radical right refers to a populist form of the radical right, given that nativism, not populism, is the ultimate core feature of the ideology of this party family. Radical right should be the primary term in the concept. Thus, for Mude, the actual core ideology of populist radical right parties is a combination of nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. And you can see that populism is the last characteristic. So what if populism does not even constitute a part of the core ideology, but rather a secondary peripheral characteristic? We think that this is a very important question to pose. So I'll start very, very briefly with our three countries and present some hypotheses and assumptions. So if you start from the Netherlands, and I know that we have at least one expert on the Netherlands, my friend Dick, and he can correct me. You start with a very, very heterogeneous and complex field by itself already. You have Pim Fortuyn, who's considered to belong to the right or the extreme right populists, and Geert Wilders later. However, careful analysis of their discourses first reveals that the version of nationalism is actually more important for both. In the first case, you have a more civic nationalism. This is how Tjitske Akkerman has termed it in a very interesting study back in 2005, and partly inclusivist, while in the second case, we find a more ethnic and sharply exclusivist nationalism, which has still some liberal elements, but when we proceed with a very careful analysis of the discourse, we find even ethno-exclusivist elements there. Also, Fortuyn's anti-Islamism stems from a liberal perspective, while Wilders has strong conspiracy theory elements. And I have here a very characteristic quotation from Geert Wilders in order to understand the difference between Pim Fortuyn and Geert Wilders. So he very recently said in a speech that, I quote, the people need to, that's the beginning of the quote, rally around the flag with which they can identify. This flag symbolizing pre-political loyalty, I think this is a key term here, can only be the flag of our nation. So there's no way to understand the people outside the nation in Pim Fortuyn's discourse. Now the example of Greece, this complicates even more things, because in Greece we have three parties that have been categorized to the extreme right, and are also considered to be populist. The Popular Orthodox Rally, Laos, we already had a paper on this party. The Golden Dawn, which is a very extremist party with neo-Nazi elements, and the independent Greeks currently co-governing with Syriza. So we have here a peculiar spectrum of the right, starting from a more moderate version of the right, or extreme right, or conservative right, populist, the ANEL, the independent Greeks, which is a mixture of nationalism, patriotism, and populism. They're more emphasizing patriotism, and they have strong anti-establishment, anti-elite elements. Then you have Laos, which is now not really relevant, but it was relevant for at least 10 years. And it has participated in the government in 2011, which is very, very close to the ideal type of the populist radical right, as described by Gas Mude, with much stronger emphasis on xenophobia and anti-immigrant positions, and also religion, Orthodox Christianity. And the last case, at the very extreme of the right, you have the Golden Dawn, which is an extremist, anti-democratic, and openly neo-Nazi party with violent action in the streets against mainly immigrants. So all three of them have been many times categorized as populist. So there are some very obvious differences and similarities that can be starting points for further research. So ANEL and Laos accept democratic processes. This is a first significant difference. While the Golden Dawn has openly advocated a version of Nazism, and it's against the parliament, the parliamentary processes. It says that they very, very reluctantly participate in the parliament, and they are disgusted with the parliament. So second, ANEL and Laos have an ethnic conception of the people, while Golden Dawn adopts a strongly ethno-racial conception of the people, pushing this even further. Xenophobia, but still there's a common element here. Xenophobia is mostly important for the Golden Dawn and Laos, but not so much for ANEL, which is mostly defined by their patriotic anti-establishment position, but still there are elements of xenophobia in ANEL too. Now to the similarities. They all are sharply exclusivist in their discourse. They are always referring to the Greek people foreigners cannot be included. And there is a very, very characteristic statement by all those parties regarding a recent law passed in the Greek parliament granting citizenship to second-generation immigrants. You are born Greek, you cannot become Greek. This was a statement by an MP of ANEL in the parliament, but also a statement that we very often see also in Laos and the Golden Dome. Last, very obvious similarity is strong conspiracy theory elements in all of them, much stronger in the Golden Dawn, combined with sharp anti-Semitism, but also strong in Laos, even stronger in ANEL. Now, moving on to the example of France, National Front and the Le Pens, from Jean-Marie Le Pen to Marine Le Pen. So for many scholars, this is the archetype of the populist right or the populist extreme right. The FN, again, we see that it identifies the people with the nation, with the French nation. Of course, it has moderated the way that is articulated this conception through the year, what in France they call the de-diabolisation of FN, the way that it has de-extremized, let's say, its discourse. But still it excludes substantial parts of immigrants, foreigners, from the people. So, but at the other side of the spectrum, of the antagonistic spectrum, the enemy of the people is considered to be the transnational elites, EU bureaucracy, sometimes the US, and it's mainly located outside the borders. So, of course, there are the political elites inside the borders that are defending certain interests that are against the people. So the rationale of a FN and the articulation between people and nation is very characteristically reflected in a very, very recent statement of Marine Le Pen. This was said during a press conference for the new Euro-parliamentary group headed by Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders and other extreme right or right-wing populist parties. So Marine Le Pen stated that the European Union is working to destroy the nation. That's what's understood, under threat, the nation. And we are here to defend our people. So you can see this dialectic. The nation is under threat, we defend the people, which is the nation. Moving on to add a comparative twist here and stress some preliminary conclusion. I have to rush a bit. We need to acknowledge the priority of nationalist and xenophobic or anti-immigrant elements in the discourse of parties usually categorized as populist or right-wing populist. Populism is indeed still a strong element, but not a core discursive or ideological feature of this party family. Despite a series of similarities, there are still significant differences among them. So we're faced with serious conceptual issues and the need to further categorization within the right-wing populist or the extreme right-wing populist family. So bringing the other side of the spectrum in, what we try to do is create an ideal type of comparison between left populism and right-wing populism. And the countries that we've taken into account were mainly Greece, France, and the Netherlands, and the respective parties, Syriza in Greece, Front de Gauche in France, and the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. So very, very briefly, our findings so far. There is a very different definition of the people in the two party families. The people as the nation on the right, and the people as the underdog in socioeconomic terms at the left. Of course, I want to stress from the very beginning, this is an ideal type. There are always exceptions, there are always variations here and there, but this may give us the tools to better categorize the two families and then do subcategorization within its party family. Moving on to the limits of the people as community, and here we're drawing on the work of Casmude and Cristobal and a very interesting recent paper. There is a sharp difference between exclusion and inclusion. In the one case, the people are rather exclusionist, termed in exclusionist terms, in exclusionary terms. And on the other hand, on the left, they are inclusionary. So on the right, you have a rather more homogeneous conception. The limit is the nation. And on the left, a more pluralist conception. The limit is the elite, the powerful few, the super rich, the establishment, and so on. Another important element, constructing threats to the people. And for this, I have to thank especially Dick Pels. We had a very, very interesting discussion while conducting an expert interview. Both the right and the left seem to create threats to the people, seem to defend the people from certain insecurities. But on the right, you see the dangers having to do with the national cultural identity, while on the left, it has to do with socioeconomic dangers, the excesses of the market, and so on, socioeconomic insecurities. Now regarding economic policies, also sharp differences, but we have seen a change on the right after the crisis of the EU broke. So the right is more market-oriented instead of taxation and state expenditure, while when it insists on social welfare, it is targeted exclusively to native people. Okay, I have to use a couple more minutes. What we term as welfare chauvinism, while on the left we find more market regulation. So constructing antagonism, on the right we find more conspiracy theories, while on the left, anti-neoliberal critique. I forgot the number here, it shouldn't be here, the 3, okay, anyway. And party hierarchies, role of the leader, not so much in terms of organization, but in terms of how it's expressed discursively. More leader-centric on the right, less leader-centric on the left. Although this is not, we still have very strong leaders on the left, Jan Marijsen in the SP, Tsipras in Syriza, but these leadership are more openly challenged from time to time. So to conclude very, very quickly, the priority of nationalism and xenophobia and racism in certain discourses can indeed be revealed through thorough discourse analysis. It also reveals that populism constitutes a rather secondary but still important element of the profile of these parties. Comparisons with the populist left shed more light on the peculiarities of the populist right. So far, we've conducted qualitative analysis. We have an ongoing quantitative analysis with lexicometric tools, as it was presented with the observatory and by Giannis and by Thomas and Titika. But last, we are testing aspects of our typology through candidate and voter surveys in collaboration with Associate Professor Ioannis Andreadis and the Laboratory of Applied Political Research, who are doing an excellent job. And this survey is ongoing, and Giannis is going to tell us more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgos. Sorry for pushing you, but it's for your own sake. I would like to welcome our colleague Ioannis Andreadis, who is now going to give us numbers and figures in all this analysis that we have heard now. Not so many, good, because figures are boring unless you can explain them well. So you have the floor for 20 minutes.
Thank you.
To talk about the way you use surveys to measure populist attitudes in political behavior.
Thank you very much, our chair, Giannis. Of course, Populismus project and Ioannis Andreadis and all the team. I apologize for stepping down. It is much easier for me while the other two presenters were presenting. It's much easier for me to attend slides while I'm attending also a talk. What we have here, I think I can be really brief and direct to the point, is a cooperation, the result of a cooperation between quantitative methods and the Populismus project. So the idea is that we have started a pilot study, and since we have been running in the Laboratory of Applied Political Research here in Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, to at least 2 studies after each election, 2 post-election studies. This is a part of the National Election Studies projects that are run in many countries in the whole world. For example, the voter study is part of the comparative study of electoral systems, which is the most applied to many countries' voter study in the whole world. And the candidate study is part of the comparative candidates survey, which is also the only one that I know that deals with parliamentary candidates. So our idea was to use some items into these questionnaires, both on the voter study, in the voter study and in the candidate study, in order to test if we can use these items to facilitate the analysis of populism and populist political parties. The idea, the main idea was that is it possible, the main question, is it possible to use these items in order to discriminate between populist parties and mainstream parties? That was the first and most critical question. And if this gives us a positive answer, the second one was, then can we use these items and possible other items into these studies in order to discriminate between right-wing populism and left-wing populism? I think that for both of these questions, we have some interesting results to present. First of all, the idea was to use the two minimum criteria that have been discussed, and I think most of the people in this, most of us in this room agree on this minimum criteria on defining populist parties. So the idea is that we have used a series of items that are targeted, their target is to measure if the political parties use these two ideas. The one is that the discourse is about the people, and the second one is the struggle between the people of the underdog and the elite. And I think I have already described this. This is the hypothesis I have been talking about. The idea is that the idea came after the initial work of Kirk Hawkins, who was the first. This is always good from the United States. You can find these examples of using quantitative approaches in other parts of political science. So Kirk Hawkins, with writing in 2010, were the first two authors that started exploring this approach of using quantitative items in order to study the populist attitudes of voters at the beginning. As you can see, this has been developed in other countries too. Ackerman, Moody, and Zasklov applied a similar set of items, a similar battery of items in the Netherlands. And finally, there was a proposal, and this was the starting point for me. There was a proposal submitted to the comparative study of electoral systems, and this is how I first saw these items, by many people. I think Cristobal was also one of the people who submitted this proposal to CSCS. So let's go to the main subject of this presentation, which is the battery of the items that have been proposed in comparative study, to the comparative study of electoral systems. As you can see, all these items try to catch these two main minimum criteria that the Essex School has proposed in order to classify a party as a populist party. We have included all these items. First of all, the first application was for the comparative candidate study, for the Greek candidate study. And I have used the red color for item 4 because, as you can see, the way it was initially expressed was targeted specifically for voters. So it says, I would rather be represented by a citizen than by a specialized politician. So in order for this item to be suitable for the candidate study, we had to make some minor changes to this statement so that it applies also to candidates. And this is how we have changed number 4. So it says people can be better represented by a citizen than by a specialized politician. And within this cooperation with the Populismus project, Giannis was the one that first proposed these two additional items that you can see, Populism 7 and 8, that we also propose for other countries that it seems that all these items are useful in order to measure populist attitudes. So, as I have already told you, the first application was done for the candidate study, for the Greek candidate study, since we had this parliamentary election in January. And as I have already told you, after each election, we ran both a candidate study and a voter study. During the first day, Giannis mentioned something like more than 300 answers. This was the previous outcome about 1 month ago. Now we have reached a number of 450, as you can see, so we have a much richer sample right now. And it tries to cover all the parliamentary parties, but unfortunately, this is not something that occurred only for this election. This is something typical for the candidate study in Greece. It is very difficult to convince the Communist Party or the Golden Dome Party to participate in this candidate study. If you would like to learn more about this, I can tell you, I can give you examples that even with alternative approaches, like we used to have a postgraduate student who was closely related to the leadership of the Communist Party, and I have personally asked him back in 2009, I think, to go and convince the Communist Party to cooperate with this, give us the email addresses of the candidates so that they can answer. The answer was negative. The Communist Party of Greece usually thinks that all these internet new technology things are something evil, I would say. I mean, Facebook and Twitter are far away from what the Communist Party would ever use. And Golden Dawn, during the previous study in 2012, the leadership one of our colleagues was able to contact them. I would like to avoid even contacting them, probably. But this is part of our research, so we have to do that. And the response by the leadership was, okay, we have just one unified attitude and the same opinion that we share. All of us, we share the same opinion. We are soldiers sharing the same opinion. So if you want us to participate, you can only send us one questionnaire to the leadership, and we are going to answer to this question. So for these two parties, unfortunately, there are not enough responses in order to use them for statistical analysis methods. We have been able to collect some, but this was a result of collecting email addresses through Google searching throughout the internet, or from the Hellenic Parliament website. But even there, if you go to the Hellenic Parliament website, you will see that although the MPs of all other parties have their personal email addresses. For example, for the Communist Party, they share the same email address. So you cannot really take advantage of this approach. The idea is, the main answer to the initial question is, can we use these items in order to discriminate between populist parties and mainstream parties? As you can see from this slide, there is a significant difference between the two populist parties in Greece participating in this study of the candidates. Syriza and ANEL both have an index, and this is an additive index. So what we have done is just added the answers of the candidates for all these 8 populist items. And as you can see, both Syriza and ANEL have a mean value above 3.5. This is a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is strongly agree. So the larger the value, the more you should expect that the party is a populist party. And the other 3 parties of the parliament, as you can see, they share a similar mean value of about 3. There is a significant difference. Even if you use proper statistical methods, you will find that the 3 mainstream parties share the same value, more or less, and this is a different value from the 2 populist parties. So our first question was answered. The answer is positive. We can use quantitative methods. We can use survey data from candidates and discriminate between populist and non-populist or mainstream parties. In addition to that, we also have been able to compare, since we have data from all these candidates, we have been able to compare between the 2 populist parties that participate in the government coalition right now. As you can see, in most of the items, they share the similar index. They answer almost the same, but there are 3 items, the item 4, 5, and 6, where you can see a significant, in terms of statistical significance, difference between these 2 parties. I can go back to this during the questions if you would like. There are some explanations that, together with Giorgos and Giannis, we have tried to give to these differences. Maybe one that is connected to what Giorgos was just presenting in his presentation is about this inclusionary or exclusionary approach of left-wing and right-wing populist parties. I would like to draw your attention to the item 6, which is what people call compromise in politics is really just selling out on one's principles. And as you can see, there is a difference here, and the difference is that the blue bar, so the independent Greek parties, ANEL, have a greater value, agree more on this item. So the idea is that the left-wing populist party, Syriza, is more open in discussing and maybe compromising on issues that they do not agree so much. On the other hand, so they are more open in discussions and maybe changing their mind, or at least accepting a different opinion. In addition to this first answer of comparing the indices and finding that the populist parties can be discriminated from the mainstream parties, the second question of our cooperation was if we can use these and additional items, as I will remind you, as I have told in the beginning, to discriminate between left-wing and right-wing populist parties. The good a benefit of using the candidate study is that in the candidate study of 2015, we have also included about 30 items which were used for the Greek voting advice application Help Me Vote. And these items cover the most important issues of the political debate for the recent elections. So we have been able to study in combination the populist items with these items that were included in Help Me Vote. And the main outcome of this analysis is that there are 2 main factors. So since I'm talking to a not so related to quantitative methods audience, I should say that there are 2 factors that determine the political behavior, the vote choice of the Greek people for the recent elections. And one of them, as you can see in this slide, combines 3 different sub-dimensions. One is the pro-European anti-Troika dimension, so it separates the parties and voters on this anti-memorandum, let's say, dimension. There is this economic left and right dimension, so we're talking about items. For example, I have already included one there, banks and utilities must be under public control. And finally, these populist items that I have presented at the beginning of this presentation. As you can see, all these sub-dimensions are aligned into a main dimension, and this was the main factor for Greek people when they decided what party they should choose for 2015 elections. And the idea is that populism, at least in Greece, is closely associated both with Euroscepticism and state interventionism, as we can see with this contrast on having banks and utilities under anything else than public control. And here is the scores on these factors of the political parties. As you can see, Syriza and ANEL again are on the same point. So on this factor, thank you, Giannis. On this factor, they have the same, exactly the same position, and the mainstream parties also share the same factor value. So the idea is that the two parties are both Eurosceptical, both populist, and both left, yes, as far as the state intervention into the economy is concerned. On the other hand, there is a second, less important factor that helped people decide which party to vote for these elections, and this is what I have been also mentioning during the previous session on, this is a Galtan dimension, so a dimension that separates traditional nationalist authoritarian parties and voters, of course, with their opposite. So the dimension was named after Green Alternative Libertarian, and this libertarian is not about economic issues, it's about socio-cultural issues. So this is the second dimension, and I'm going to go directly to the outcome of this comparison. As you can see here, ANEL and Syriza, the two partners in this current government coalition, are totally opposite on this dimension. You can see that Syriza is on the left of this dimension with a very low value, and ANEL is very close to New Democracy, so there is a chasm between this second dimension. But the idea is that they are able to form a government mostly because the other dimension is much more important in the current political situation in Greece. And I'm going to show you also a similar, very fast, I'm going to go through some slides about a very similar study that we have done on the data that have been collected through this Help Me Vote voting advice application. It is going, this part of our paper, or our second paper, because this is most probably a separate paper, will be using the voter study data that are collected right now. We're in the middle of this collection of the voter study. The idea is that there are similar factors. I have been presenting the factors of the candidate study, but exactly the same factors are for the voter study, for the Help Me Vote data. And I'm going to give you three examples of the contrast between the parties on some of these items that have been used in Help Me Vote. Here is a statement: the people and not the politicians should make our most important policy decisions. This is an item that tries to capture these populist attitudes dimension that I have been talking about. And as you can see, there is a significant difference between New Democracy, PASOK, and Potami on the one hand, that they are agree in a lower level with this item. And on the other hand, Golden Dawn, Independent Greeks, Syriza, and KUKE are on the same side. And we have already discussed about this item, banks and utilities. This is an example of state interventionism. And you can see that all three mainstream parties, or the older, they are not the older now, also have a lower level of agreement with this item, and the other parties are together again. And finally, this is the difference between the right-wing and left-wing populist parties. Again, as you can see, Syriza and ANEL here on an issue that deals with immigrants, speaks about immigration policy. There is a significant difference between these two parties, with ANEL being together with Golden Dawn and New Democracy, and Syriza being together with the other parties that are more positive towards immigrants. So, the main conclusions. The idea is that we can use quantitative methods. We can use these 8 items of populist to measure populist attitudes, and by building an index using these answers from these items, we can discriminate between populist and mainstream parties. And so for other countries, it would be useful to also apply this, or try to convince the people that that work on the voter studies and the candidate studies to include these items there. As I have already told you, there is a proposal to be included in the CSCS, so if this is done, then many countries will have these items. And the other main conclusion is that there is a significant difference between right-wing and left-wing populist parties, and this is mainly a verification of Christobal's and the discrimination between these two different political populist parties about inclusion or exclusion of specific subgroups of the citizens. So I would like to thank you very much for attending this.